qualifying championships for the 70s. Hello, my name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and welcome back to another episode of my Qualifying Championships series. Now, if you have not seen the first episode of the series where I cover the 2010s, today we are looking at the 70s. I'll pop a little playlist to that in a card in the corner. Now, the whole premise of this series is to replay every single season of Formula 1 decade by decade, but instead of counting points off of the race results, I'm looking at the qualifying results instead, and scoring points using the 2010 point system, 25 for first, 18 for second, all the way down to 1 for 10th, in order for me to be able to compare each decade and each season together at the end of this series. And so without further ado, we will jump straight on into the qualifying championships for 1979 down to 1970. So of course we start off with 1979, which is won by Jacques Laffite, ahead of Villeneuve, Jabouille, then Jones as well, just ahead of Scheckter also. A very, very close championship there. And then we just pull up the percentage points distribution for the driver pairings, and this is calculated by adding up Laffite's and Villeneuve's points and then dividing it by the total number of available points after the USA East Grand Prix, then doing the same for Jabouille and Jones, then the same for Scheckter and Depailler. And we see that there are 23.5% of the available points went to the top two drivers, 21.4% went to the second pair, and so on and so forth. We also then had 49.6% of the available points to Laffite going his way. That is less than half the available points going to the champion. A very, very close year. I can then work out a gradient for the graph on the right as well, and that is 2.54. The shallower this gradient, the fairer the year. The steeper this gradient, the more unfair this year was. And then just taking a look at the positions graph for 1979, we see that Laffite scored 4 pole positions, but that was about it. He was only on the front row when he scored a pole position. He was also the only driver to score points in every single round. If Villeneuve had scored points in Britain, they would have been shared on that record also. But just chucking this graph into the side, we can pull up the number of pole positions: 4 for Laffite, 4 for Jabouille, 3 for Jones, 2 for Arnoux, 1 for Villeneuve and 1 for Scheckter also, with 68.7% of drivers who competed this year scoring points, and then 18.7% of those drivers scored a pole. And with 1979 all done and dusted, we jump on into 1978, and it is Andretti who comes away with the championship, absolutely dominating Peterson, 117 points clear, with Lauda in P3 ahead of Reutemann also. Shoving this graph into the corner and then pulling up the percentage points distribution for the driver pairings, 31.5 went to the top two, leaping all the way down to 22.1 for the second driver pair. 78.3% of the points went to Andretti, a big leap up from 49.6 of 79, with a linear gradient that is much, much steeper, a very uneven distribution of the points across the leaderboard of 3.6. And moving to the positions graph, we see that like the year before in 79, Andretti is the only driver to score points in every single round. And just moving this on into the corner, we can count up the number of pole positions. That is 8 across the whole year for Andretti, 3 for Peterson, 2 for Reutemann, 1 for Lauda and 1 for Watson also, with 52.9% of the drivers who competed scoring points and 14.7% scoring a pole. And then heading back to 1977, it is James Hunt who comes away with the championship ahead of Mario Andretti, John Watson and Niki Lauda in P4, with Scheckter in P5 as well. It was a close fought championship between Hunt and Andretti, just 8 points in it at the end. And shoving this graph into the corner, we can pull up the percentage points distribution for the driver pairings. A whopping 32.4% of the available points went to the top two drivers, with 20% going to Watson and Lauda. With 66.4% of the points going to Hunt, that's a little bit less than 1978, but the linear gradient is very actually shallow, as lots and lots and lots of people scored points of 2.51. And looking at the positions graph for 1977, Hunt started extremely well. 3 pole positions on the bounce, but he then went on a little dry streak as Andretti managed to catch up with his 3 pole positions in a row from Belgium to France. And chucking this into the corner, we can add up all of these pole positions. 7 for Andretti, who ended up P2, 6 for Hunt, 2 for Lauda, 1 for Watson, and 1 for Scheckter as well, with 26.2 of the drivers scoring points, and 11.2 scoring a pole. I'm fairly sure that's supposed to be 56, because 26 is absolutely appallingly low. And I've just checked my little maths calculations. Yes, that is supposed to be 56% of the drivers scoring points, not 26. And so we head from 1977 to 1976, and it is James Hunt again who comes away with the championship for McLaren, 58 points clear of Lauda, with Depailler in third and Regazzoni in fourth, ahead of Peterson also. And shoving this graph into the corner, we can see the points distribution for the driver pairings. Again, an extremely high volume of points for the top two drivers, with leaping it down almost half to 17.6 for the second driver pairing. 72% of the points went to Hunt, still not the highest we've had so far this episode, and a linear gradient that is considerably low of 2.54. And then taking a look at the positions graph for 1976, we see that again Hunt started extremely well, being in the top 3 for the first 5 rounds, and also scoring 3 pole positions in the same time frame. And then chucking this into the corner, we can see that out of all of the drivers, Hunt scored 8 pole positions this year. Lauda 3, Regazzoni 1, Peterson 1, Scheckter 1, Andretti 1, and Lafitte 1 also, with 62.8% of the drivers scoring points, and 20% exactly scoring a pole. Then heading to the halfway house of today's episode, 1975, it is Lauda who comes away with his first championship ahead of Carlos Pace and Regazzoni as well, just ahead of Jarier in P4. But Lauda stormed to this championship, 148 points clear of Carlos Pace. And moving this graph into the corner, we can pull up the percentage points distribution for the driver pairings. 30% went to the top 2, down to 16.5% for the second driver pairing. 81.7% of the points went to Lauda, the highest of today's episode so far, with a linear gradient that is considerably steep of 3.12. And taking a look at the positions graph, we can see that Lauda didn't start particularly well. It was actually Jarier who got off to a better start, but once Lauda got going from Spain onwards, he was a dominant force. And just counting up the number of pole positions, 9 for Lauda, 2 for Jarier, 1 for Pace, 1 for Brambilla, and 1 for Price also, with 56.2% of the drivers scoring points, and only 15.6 scoring a pole. Then we head down on into 1974, and it is Niki Lauda again who comes away with the championship. 124 points clear from Regazzoni, another dominant year from Niki Lauda. Fittipaldi is P3 and Reutemann is P4. And chucking this graph to the side, we can pull up the points distribution for the driver pairings. Another high volume of points for the top 2 drivers, with another steep drop off to the second driver pairing also, with 80.5% of the points going to Lauda, another very strong year from Niki, and a linear gradient of 2.73, with a positions graph that looks a little bit like this. Again, not getting off to the best of starts, but he hit a extremely good run of 6 pole positions in a row from the Netherlands to Italy, absolutely dominating this year. And counting up all the pole positions, it is again 9 for Lauda, 2 for Fittipaldi, 1 for Regazzoni, 1 for Reutemann, 1 for Peterson, and 1 for Depailler also, with 57.9% of drivers competing, scoring points, and 15.8 scoring poles. And then heading on into 1973, it is Ronnie Peterson who comes away with the championship. 131 points clear from Stewart, ahead of Holm and Emerson Fittipaldi also. Extremely dominant years for the past 3 that we've had so far. And moving this table off to the side, we can pull up the distribution. Again, 32.4% of the points going to the top 2 drivers, 23 going to Holm and Fittipaldi, and then 16 for Siver and Revson also, with 82.9% of the available points going to Peterson himself. That is the highest of today's episode, and a steep linear gradient of 2.93. And then the positions table for this year looks something like this. Again, Peterson not getting off to the best of starts, only really picking up at Spain, and then he was dominant from there, with a small drop-off in France. But counting up the pole positions, we can see that Peterson, like Lauda before him, scored 9, Stewart 3, Holm 1, Fittipaldi 1, and Regazzoni 1 also, with 58.3% of drivers scoring points, and only 13.8 scoring a pole. And then heading on down to 1972, it is Fittipaldi who scores himself a championship, just 5 points ahead of Stewart, with Ix also in that battle as well, and then a short way down is Hulme in P4 ahead of Regazzoni as well. But chucking this table over to the side, we can pull up the distribution for the driver pairings. A low 28.3% of the points for the top two, with 23.7 going to Ix and Hulme as well, with 58% of the points going to Fittipaldi, a much fairer year than the past few for Peterson and Lauders too also, with a low linear gradient of 2.49. And then taking a look at the positions graph for 1972, again, Fittipaldi didn't get off to a good start. The champion hasn't had very good starts so far in any of these years in this episode, and counting up all the pole positions, we see that Ix actually came away with more. 4 pole positions, Emerson with 3, 2 for Stewart, 1 for Revson, 1 for Amon, and 1 for Reutemann as well, with 58.9% of drivers scoring points and 18.4 scoring a pole. And then heading on into the penultimate year of today's episode, 1971, it is Jackie Stewart who comes away with the championship ahead of Ix, 76 points clear, and then Regazzoni in P3 with Siffert in P4 as well. And moving this table off to the side, we can work out the distribution of points. 32.6 for the top two, 22.5 for the second pair as well, with 79.6% of the available points going to Stewart, and a linear gradient of 2.8 exactly. And then taking a look at the positions table for this year, we finally see the champion get off to a good start with a pole position in South Africa for Stewart, then a P4 in Spain, and then a string of pole positions, P3s and P2s up until Austria. And then counting up the number of pole positions, we can see that Stewart took 6, Ix took 2, then Regazzoni, Siffert and Amon all took 1, with 52.5% of the drivers scoring points and 12.5 scoring a pole. And so we move to the final year of today's episode, 1970, and it is Jackie Ix who comes away with the championship, just 1 point clear of Jackie Stewart, 216 points to 215. Then 76 points back from that is Jochen Rindt, and then Amon is P4. And moving this aside and working out the distribution, 32.8% of the available points went to the top two, 20.5 went to Rindt and Amon, with a total percentage of points being 66.5 going to Ix, with a linear gradient of the lowest of today's episode of 2.21. And then taking a look at this championship battle, the closest of today's episode, in the form of the positions table, we can see that it was Stewart who got off to the better start, but then it was Ix who managed to carry that all the way to the end. But both drivers scored points in every single round. But if it wasn't for the P8 in Britain for Stewart, if that was a P7, that would have been enough for him to secure the championship. But counting up the pole positions for this year, we see that Ix and Stewart both took 4, Rindt took 3, Regazzoni 1 and Brambilla 1 also, with 73.5% of drivers this year scoring points, the biggest so far in this decade and in fact for the past few decades, and 14.7 scoring a pole. And there we go, there is the 1970s all done and dusted in the form of qualifying championships based off of the 2010 points system. Now there's just one more table to show you, and that is just ranking these past 10 years in a little table in the order from the best to the worst based on the 4 categories that we saw just now: the gradient, the percentage points going to the champion, the percentage of drivers who scored points, and the percentage who scored a pole also. And so that is on screen now, and 1970 was declared the best year, all the way down to 1978, which was declared the worst year. And then, of course, we just have a smattering of all the others in the middle. But there we go, that is the end of this episode. The 1970s are all done and dusted. Thank you guys so much for watching, but if you have agreed with anything that I've said, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any suggestions for video improvements, also let me know. Or if you have your own video idea, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. My email is also available if you'd like to contact me via that instead. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.